So just took a look at the last video, and by all means, there are lots of mistakes in that video, but it was important for me to move forward. Don't have the time to go back and do any editing, so be patient with me. I'd love to have the time to really develop the videos and make them perfect for you, but I don't have the time right now, so we'll go ahead and move forward with and start with the well, if you think for a minute about where we left off, the Roman Empire collapses around 500 AD, and so you have a dark period in history called the Dark Ages, Middle Ages, and it's about 1,000 year period where people became a bit with a lack of order, no Roman Empire to no government, no sense of order. People began to roam around and became very transient throughout Europe, moving around, kind of like gypsies. And there was a lot of superstition, a lot of beliefs in dragons, and it was a pretty cold, dark place, but they made some beautiful transient art, like belt buckles, the the design on a sword sword handle, so something that could be moved around with them. But what happens about 1,000 years after the collapse of the Roman Empire, there was an intersection that took place, what I call an intersection, where two things come together and create, it's a spark of energy that creates something. I don't know, it's sort of a game of chance, you might say. But there's a combination of Christianity and the church began to build power, and feudalism. And these were a series of little city states, governments, communities that started to create some order, and people began to move into this to these and take refuge in the church. And there was this sort of great, well, it was not sorta, it was a great building boom that took place. So these churches began to evolve, and cathedrals, and there was a grand competition throughout Europe. This is one of the earlier structures. You might want to take a look at it, especially if you're interested in architecture or design. It's the church, religion. The cathedrals are a great place to stop and pause and take a look, study. The interior of the cathedrals, there was two things. There was in talking about purpose and function. As the cathedrals were building and getting taller and taller, the windows, and they understood how to create something that was permanent, and they experimented again for 1,000 years. But what happens here, in this case, the windows got bigger as things got taller, and they understood what they needed to do, engineering, architecture, structure, etc. But the purpose of the stained glass windows was to let in this light, so it really would strike a sense of awe as people from the Christian Crusades would come into the church as a place of refuge, and were stricken by this great beauty, and it was symbolic of the representation of God. The other thing too was these are actually Bible stories. These people coming in were illiterate, and so they used the visual means of communication to create these Bible stories for people to study and learn from. So they began to build, after they built all these cathedrals. Well, they're still doing them, but the bulk of this sort of frenzy that took place ended, and there was a rebirth, and it was called the Renaissance. And this was a great period of wealth. And I use the word fluent a lot, but when I say fluent, I'm talking about the fluidity of how great wealth and abundance creates the art of great art, these artifacts that evolve out of this abundance, the fluidity having to do with the ability to invest in the arts in such a way that create the great art that we see when we look back at these periods in history. Their cultures and civilizations are at the height of their intensity, their success, their ability to produce what you see here. This is Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper. And it's a fresco, and it is one of the greatest works of art from this time period during the Renaissance. Something to take a look at. There's a lot of stories behind this. I think there's an entire movie made after this, which is amazing. The kind of things that how art is used to create movies, the clothing, the wardrobe, think what people were wearing, what they were eating, how they were sitting, what did their hair look like when they create these shows that we watch on TV. Now this slide is an example. Is actually the Halls and Mirrors, the Palace of Versailles, and the date is 1678. And there is if you go into your art book, art appreciation text, there will be a timeline, so you'll be able to get a feeling for what's happening, how one thing leads to another, but this is just prior to the French Revolution, and it's a period called Rococo, and it's where there was an extreme indulgence by the wealthy to create these magnificent, gorgeous works. It's a little over the top for me, but it's excessive and it's opulent, and you can go on tour and walk through this. I think it's still available after the pandemic is over anyway. But it's some great beauty, but it was excessive. And I say that because 98% of the population were starving. 2% of the population lived within this abundance. So as nature would take its course, there was something that happened just after. And these art movements really tell a story. And when you leave the Rococo period, the next art movement is called neoclassicism. And I'll take you there here in just a minute. So here's the neoclassical period. And you have, it is a period that was it was happening during as I understand it, it was happening during the French Revolution, and it was very political. The work was very political. Purpose and function was to influence and direct the revolution. So this is an artist named David who did this work, and you can look him up, and there's some other pieces by his. Notice stylistically how different the work is, and I want us to start talking about stylistic characteristics, also called visual characteristics, but it's the kind of color palette that's being used, it's the texture, it's the way they handle the paint, it's the simplicity of a form or the stiffness of a form. What are they doing? What is the subject matter? In this case, it was a political narration. Following the revolution and following the neoclassical period, it only makes sense that the artists began to paint it was called realism, and this is by an artist named Courbet. He was, and what he painted were scenes of men, women doing things in daily life. So it wasn't about this excess and abundance that you saw in the Rococo period. Quite in contrast, you see men and women doing things at work. And there's a whole series or a period. A lot of people enjoy this period in history. It's about everyday life for the masses, what we do. the 90%, 98% of us. Here you have a painting by Vincent van Gogh, and so I'm leaping. I want you to realize that I'm skipping art periods in history. It's a really hard decision for me to make what to leave out. There's so much available, and there were so many wonderful movements from realism. There was Impressionism, and then you had the Post-Impressionists, and this is Van Gogh, Vincent van Gogh. And notice how abstract and expressive the paintings have become. This is a search for, and it is artists began to, as we can, the culture changes. Art is always a reflection of the culture. And so what he's working with is not a concern for representing something realistic, but was more about human emotion. And the artists began to move inside and express their feelings. And they would distort the color and form to make that happen.